All right, so I'm in the middle of filming another video that you are probably either going to watch or have just watched. I needed to switch cameras to, rebalance for my Canon M50 only because I'm filming with the A7S III that I normally have this thing balanced for. And I figured while I'm rebalancing it, one of the things I've always struggled with is balancing the gimbal, but also following the directions specifically for DJI. The nice thing is the app directs you to videos for each balancing point. I figured I'd take an opportunity to walk through how I see balancing the gimbal so that no matter what gimbal you get, you'll always be able to do it logically and intuitively. So first, what's the purpose of balancing a gimbal? What is that achieving? The whole point of balancing the gimbal is so that the motors can be stress-free in any position that they're in, and they can basically just apply their balancing algorithm as evenly as possible to get the gimbal to point the camera in whatever direction it needs to at all times, and essentially do it seamlessly. So to be able to rotate this whole thing all over the place, but the camera's always pointing in one direction. And if it's not properly balanced, it won't do that. Or it'll even go further and just like shake and be like, oh, I can't do this. So how do you actually accomplish that? The way you accomplish that is by figuring out the center of mass of the camera. And that's why the size of the lens you have, and also when you zoom, this is a prime lens, but when you zoom in and out, especially when you have an external barrel, that center of mass is going to change and the balance will change. Finding that center of balance through trial and error on this is exactly what you're doing. And that's why you lock out all the axes and then go one by one in each plane to find the balance of that plane. And then ultimately you find your, overall center of mass. So let's do that. So I'm starting by unlocking all of the axes, and you can see it is going everywhere, right? Okay. So the first thing you actually want to do is get the camera on the thing. Now let's see what happens. Clearly it's not balanced, right? So the first axis we're going to start with, or the first joint we're going to start with, is the inner joint, like I said. And that includes probably the most complicated and most important part of the balancing because it actually takes care of two axes. The x-axis in this direction and the y-axis in this direction. And that is when it's at normal, because if you put it this way, x and y are different. So what I'm going to do is completely imbalance it. So which axis do you work on first in these? Most of the time, for example, DJI recommends that you adjust this height first, which is this back axis here, this adjustment. And then they tell you to adjust it until the camera automatically sits vertically. Now, why is that the case? Understanding why this is the case will allow you to adjust either axis first, whichever way you want, and you'll know which one's the problem. The goal, because there's two axes involved here, you want to neutralize one and then work on the other, because you know that the other one, the first one, is neutralized. So let's do it the way DJI would recommend, which is to adjust this one first. And the goal is to adjust it so that the camera automatically falls vertically. Now we notice it's still pointing this way a little bit. What does that mean? That means definitely this side's way too heavy and it's bringing it down. But between this part of the camera and this part of the camera, this side is a bit heavier. So if this side's heavier, we need to put weight on that side, which means move this up a little bit. And now we see it's pretty much vertical, but it's facing down. So what if I took this? Now it's facing up. And now it goes vertically. Now, why does that occur? Well, because in these two planes, there is a center of mass in this direction and in this direction. Now, in this direction, we can clearly see, right? The length of it, it's long, so it's either going to go this way or that way. But by neutralizing this center of mass and putting it smack in the middle in terms of verticality, what it basically means is in this position, the weight being applied on this part of the camera, the top of the camera, and the bottom of the camera is even. So any imbalance that occurs, in this case, since we've made this side and this side even, the only imbalance that's occurring is on this side versus this side. And when you let it go, it goes vertically. Another way of putting that is by putting this top part of the camera and the bottom part of the camera even relative to the center of mass in this direction, you've removed any influence of this side or this side, and any imbalance in this direction will cause it to just go to zero. It's an on-off switch. Whereas, let's say this side was too far this way. It was too high up. It would go vertical, but this side would be more in favor of gravity, and it would go like that. Versus, if I were to drop it down, then this part, the bottom part of the camera, would favor gravity, and it would be imbalanced this way. Now you've created neutrality, and the only imbalance that occurs is based on the front or the back of the camera. This part or this part. Then we can adjust this to get neutrality. And the reason I did that so quickly, well, it actually isn't completely balanced. So it looks like this side's too heavy. Just slightly. So we're going to move it up a little bit. And now we have balance. It's just sitting where it needs to sit. Now let's do this in the other direction. Let's unbalance it again. It's not balanced. Let's adjust this direction first. So we're going in the opposite direction of what DJI recommended. Now, based on the principles that we just talked about, what would you expect a properly balanced forward-backward movement to look like? Well, if we're moving this forward or backward, then we're neutralizing the effect of this side of the camera and this side of the camera. So it should sit perfectly horizontal. I'd say that's pretty balanced. So it's not sitting where we want it to sit, and it's swinging back here. But how do we know if we need to go up or down? Well, in this case, it's obvious we need to go up because this is at the farthest to the bottom. But let's say I moved it here. How do I know if I need to move it up or down? Well, if we think about, again, those principles, we're now, these two sides are neutralized, right? They're even, which is why it's sitting flat. But something is weighing in one direction or another. Which side is favoring gravity? Well, if the top favored gravity, it would be sitting like this. But the bottom's favoring gravity, so it needs to move up. Now it flipped upside down. Now we also notice here that it's not actually sitting perfectly horizontal, which means my x-axis, this one, is still problematic. So for the purposes of highlighting these principles, I'm going to balance this direction upside down. All right, which direction do I need to move it? Well, this part is favoring gravity, so we need to move it that way. There you go. But now we see that the bottom of the camera is favoring gravity, which means it's probably too high. And I just happened to hit the right mark there. So now what we've done is we've made the influence of this part of the camera and this part of the camera even. And we've also made the influence of this part and this part of the camera even. So the center of mass along two axes is now, if you were to draw a graph, it would be right in the middle of that graph. Although I don't think it's fully balanced yet. And that's where the tricky part becomes. So if you notice when I just did that adjustment, it was falling into this position. Now, it's not doing that, right? But it was falling into this position. So it's off balance in a diagonal, right? If you were to think about it, this graph, it's imbalanced in this direction because it's sitting like that. So which axis do you need to fix? That's why you adjust one versus the other first until one just goes directly to zero, if that makes sense. Once you've done that, that's the hardest part. Now each adjustment you make is just a matter of it's too heavy on one side versus the other. So let's do the rest. Unlock it, and we see, very simple, it's only moving in one direction. It's either going to be too heavy this side or too heavy on that side. And so we adjust it accordingly. Now notice what I just did here. It was difficult to move it even though this was nice and loose, but because there's weight on the gimbal itself, it's making it difficult to adjust. So you take the weight off and you move it. And again, when the camera stays where it is, wherever you put it, you know that the roll axis is now balanced. And then last is your pan axis. Now, right now, this doesn't have any strain on it, so it's not going to really do anything. There's nothing to indicate a weight in either direction. So what you have to do is bring it in this direction, and you'll notice that it is too heavy on this side. So now if we turn on the gimbal, everything should be fine. And in the case of the DJI, you have an auto tune, which will just balance everything. And everything works according to plan. So I know I got really technical there, but I hope all of that makes sense. Hopefully those are principles that you can carry into any gimbal, and it'll help you to understand. And even if you do still follow the directions, which is totally fine and appropriate, it'll at least make sense and you can adjust it much more quickly and more easily in the future when you have to tweak it and rebalance it, or if you throw another camera on. Anyway, leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you have any further insight into helping explain that, definitely leave that in the comments below. And let me know if this helped you, if this benefited you in your next balancing. See you next time.